There's a moment that happens in professional football when everyone in the room knows something fundamental has shifted, but nobody wants to be the first person to actually say it out loud. The conversations stop. People exchange glances. Scouts exchange slow nods instead of words. Teammates erupt in genuine celebration instead of polite acknowledgement. Defenders shake their heads in recognition instead of frustration. These aren't random occurrences. These are biological responses to witnessing something rare enough that it overrides years of professional training designed to suppress emotional reactions on practice fields. That's exactly what occurred on a Tuesday morning in Berea, Ohio, at the Cleveland Browns facility, and what I'm about to walk you through completely reshapes how we need to think about the franchise's quarterback future. This isn't speculation. This isn't hype built from one good play or inflated expectations. This is about multiple professional evaluators, scouts with decades of experience, coaching staff members, and observers all simultaneously recognizing that something significant happened during official team activities on May 19, 2026. What transpired that morning had been cemented since the voluntary off-season sessions concluded in April. Before we dig into what actually happened, you need to understand the setup, because the setup explains why what followed was so shocking to everyone watching. Deshaun Watson walked into those OTAs as the clear, unambiguous favorite. This wasn't speculation. This wasn't media narrative building or internet conjecture. This was organizational consensus at the highest levels. Watson had the credentials that don't lose starting positions easily. 3 Pro Bowl selections on his resume. Nearly $250 million guaranteed in the contract he signed with this franchise. The kind of NFL resume that carries legitimate weight in evaluation rooms. When you hand a quarterback that much money, that much investment, that kind of security, you don't bench him because a rookie had a good week in May. That's not how professional football organizations operate. The narrative going into these OTAs was already written. Watson was the guy. Every report filtering out of Cleveland in April pointed precisely the same direction. Multiple sources within the organization had been pointing to Watson as the presumed starter. The voluntary sessions, the private conversations with Todd Monken, the new head coach's apparent alignment with the veteran quarterback. Everything suggested an organizational decision had essentially already been made. The math was simple enough that even casual observers could understand it. You don't hand a franchise quarterback $230 million guaranteed and then bench him because a first-round pick had an impressive practice session. The financial commitment alone was staggering. When organizations tie that much capital to a single player, they're broadcasting a message about organizational direction. They're saying this is our guy. This is who we've committed to. We're not second-guessing this decision based on practice performance. That kind of investment creates organizational momentum that's difficult to reverse. It colors how coaching staffs view competition. It influences evaluation processes. It creates psychological weight that's hard for younger players to overcome. Shedeur Sanders, by this logic, was supposed to absorb the system gradually. He was supposed to learn the offense, understand Todd Monken's terminology, study how NFL defenses operate, and earn his opportunities down the line. That's the traditional path. That's how these things typically work in professional football. Rookie quarterbacks don't walk into official team installations on day one and completely rewrite the competitive narrative. That's not the normal sequence of events. That's not how organizational consensus typically gets disrupted. The expectation was measured patience, development, a long-term investment in a young talent while the established veteran managed the present. Watson would handle the real work while Sanders absorbed knowledge on the sidelines. This approach made perfect sense from every angle. It had organizational logic. It had financial logic. It had veteran experience logic. Everything pointed toward Watson as the clear winner of this competition before it even officially began. But here's what matters about how narratives work in professional sports. They gain weight through repetition. Once enough people say something is true, it begins to feel inevitable. Once the consensus solidifies, it becomes difficult to imagine any outcome that contradicts the established story. By the time May 19th arrived, the narrative had hardened into something that felt almost predetermined. Watson was the starter. That was the story. Sanders was the promising prospect learning the ropes. That was his place in the larger narrative. What made May 19th genuinely shocking to everyone who witnessed it wasn't just that Sanders played well. Plenty of players have impressive individual practices. Plenty of young quarterbacks show competence in controlled environments. What made it shocking was the specific context in which the performance occurred and the complete mismatch between expectations and reality. The environment on that Tuesday morning was legitimately hostile to rookie success. This wasn't a walkthrough. This wasn't a cooperative practice where defenses played soft and coaches offered gentle encouragement from the sidelines. This was a competitive environment designed specifically to expose a young quarterback's weaknesses. The Browns' secondary was disguising coverages. Safeties were switching at the final moment. Throwing windows were being compressed intentionally. Every tactic, every strategy, every defensive alignment was designed to make a young quarterback look confused and overwhelmed. They weren't being polite about it either. These were professional defenders with explicit organizational instructions to test the rookie, to push him, to see how he handled legitimate pressure. That's what competitive team activities are supposed to do. They're supposed to replicate NFL conditions as closely as possible so coaching staffs can gather meaningful evaluation information. And against that legitimately hostile environment, against defenses specifically designed to expose him, against experienced NFL professionals tasked with making him fail, Shedeur Sanders completed passes at over 90%. Now, I understand the automatic response. OTA completion rates get written off constantly. No pads, no contact. No real consequences. Practice reps that don't count toward anything official. The completion percentage seems inflated because the environment seems softer than actual games. But you have to sit with what that number actually represents when you understand the context. 13 snaps across 7-on-7 drills and full 11 on 11 team periods against a secondary that was genuinely trying to make him fail. This wasn't a participation trophy performance. This was precision operating under legitimate pressure. The setup mattered because it established what everyone expected to happen. Watson was the clear favorite. The narrative was settled. Sanders was the promising prospect in a developmental role. And then May 19th happened, and everything that had seemed so certain began to shift in ways nobody anticipated. What made May 19th different wasn't simply that Sanders had a good practice. Football is filled with good practices that don't translate into anything meaningful. Players have productive sessions all the time. What made this specific day fundamentally different was the environment surrounding the performance and the collision between expectations and reality. Everyone in that facility anticipated Watson would demonstrate the steadiness of an established veteran. They expected Sanders would show promise, but also reveal the limitations of a first-day rookie experiencing an NFL system for the first time under game speed conditions. Instead, what transpired challenged every single assumption about how this competition would unfold. The morning started like most OTA sessions. Equipment distributed, players stretching. Coaching staff moving through position groups, working on fundamentals, installing new concepts from Todd Monken's offensive system. Nothing dramatic, nothing that suggested this would be the day everything changed. But as the drills progressed and the quality of competition increased, something became evident to everyone watching. The quality of quarterback play on the field wasn't following the expected pattern. The Browns secondary was tasked with a specific mission on that Tuesday: expose the rookie. That's what competitive practices are designed to do. Defenses disguise their coverages. Safeties switch their assignments at the final moment. Linebackers flow to unexpected gaps. Coverage rotations happen later than a quarterback ideally wants. Throwing windows compress at the exact moment when young quarterbacks typically panic. All of these things are designed to create realistic NFL conditions where decision-making becomes difficult and processing speed is genuinely tested. Against this legitimately challenging environment, Sanders operated with a composure that seemed almost unusual for a first official installation. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't hesitating. He wasn't exhibiting the kinds of freshman mistakes that typically emerge when young quarterbacks face their first NFL speed defense. Instead, he was moving through progressions smoothly. He was recognizing coverages. He was adjusting his mechanics based on what he was seeing. He was demonstrating an understanding of concepts that seemed more advanced than expected for a first day. The completion rate above 90% became meaningful in this context because it represented accuracy under pressure. These weren't simple screens to running backs or uncovered receivers. These were throws into contested windows against defenders who were specifically instructed to disrupt. These were decisions made in real time against disguised coverages and complex defensive schemes. The number itself might sound routine in isolation, but placed within the actual circumstances of that practice, it represented something genuinely significant. One particular moment from the 7-on-7 drills became the focal point for multiple evaluators and scouts watching from the sidelines. The drill itself was designed specifically to test how young quarterbacks respond when plays break down. Structure collapses. Roots don't develop as planned. Pressure arrives faster than anticipated. These are the moments when young quarterbacks typically abandon the offense and try to create something improvisational, which usually results in disaster. Sanders faced exactly this situation. The play structure was deteriorating. Pressure was building. The immediate read was covered. Every indicator suggested this was an incompletion waiting to happen. This was the moment where a young quarterback either learns quickly or reveals significant limitations. This was the moment where years of training in pocket geometry either existed or didn't exist in a player's instinctive response. What Sanders did in that moment revealed something critical about his foundational understanding of quarterback play. He didn't panic. He didn't bail. He didn't take off and try to improvise around the broken play. He stepped deliberately into the pressure, and he maintained his focus downfield while doing it. His eyes stayed with the progression. He adjusted his platform laterally within the pocket. He modified his base as defenders closed space. Every movement demonstrated an understanding of how to operate within a collapsing structure while maintaining offensive integrity. This distinction between panicking out of structure and moving calmly within it is one of the most fundamental evaluations in quarterback assessment. Offensive coordinators will tell you one is theoretically coachable. The other is instinctual. It exists in a player's body and mind when he walks into an NFL facility or it doesn't. You cannot teach someone the instinctive response to pressure. You can teach them progressions. You can teach them concepts. You can teach them roots. But the biological response to collapsing structures, the instinctive understanding of how to operate when everything is breaking down, that's something different. Sanders demonstrated the instinctual version. Multiple evaluators confirmed this afterward. It wasn't something that required extensive analysis or debate. It was observable in real time. When pressure arrived, he handled it the way experienced quarterbacks handle it, with composure, with structure, with awareness of where defenders were moving and where windows were developing. What happened next would prove even more significant. As the throw was being released, everything about Sanders' mechanics suggested it shouldn't be attempted. His base was compromised. His weight distribution was terrible. He was leaning backward rather than forward. By every physical indicator available to someone watching, he should have pulled the ball down, accepted the incompletion, jogged back to the huddle, and prepared for the next play. That's the safe decision. That's the conservative decision. That's what veteran quarterbacks with years of experience do when the math suggests risk outweighs reward. Sanders made a different choice. He trusted his arm talent and mechanics to accomplish what his body position couldn't support in that moment. He held the ball slightly longer. He threw it into a window that was closing at the instantaneous rate that NFL coverage windows actually close. And the ball arrived in the receiver's hands with perfect timing, perfect placement, and perfect trajectory. The silence that followed the completion spoke volumes. Defenders just stared. No words. No casual acknowledgement of a good play. Just silence and stares. That particular reaction communicates more than any verbal response could possibly convey. Breaking down individual plays from a practice session might seem like microanalysis, but in quarterback evaluation, specific throws often tell you more than statistics. Completion percentages provide context. Video confirms what the numbers suggest. But certain throws reveal something about a player's foundational understanding of the position and his willingness to make difficult decisions under pressure. 3 throws from May 19th stand out as particularly revealing about why multiple evaluators left that facility genuinely impressed. The first throw we've already discussed provided the foundation for understanding Sanders' pocket presence under pressure. But what made that particular completion genuinely meaningful wasn't just that he completed it. It was how he completed it. The throw itself required arm talent. It required accuracy under duress. It required the confidence to trust mechanics when everything in the moment suggested pulling the ball down would be the smarter decision. For a first-day rookie, that's not typical. Most young quarterbacks in their first official installation are still processing information. They're still learning terminology. They're still trying to figure out where roots are developing. Sanders was already operating with the kind of confidence that comes from preparation and understanding. The second throw that stands out involved a more subtle decision-making process, but revealed equally important information about his cognitive processing. During a subsequent 7-on-7 drill, Sanders lined up on what appeared to be a standard progression. The primary read was developing. The defense was playing coverage that seemed relatively straightforward. But as the play developed, coverage rotated in a way that compressed the throwing window on the initially planned throw. At that precise moment, when the primary read disappeared, Sanders demonstrated an understanding of secondary options and progression concepts that suggested genuine preparation. He wasn't just hoping something developed downfield. He was actively progressing through options and anticipating defensive adjustments. What made this throw particularly impressive was the execution. Rather than forcing the primary read into coverage or panicking because his first option closed, Sanders moved to the secondary options smoothly. The throw was on time. It was on target. It demonstrated pre-snap preparation and understanding of how the defense was likely to adjust post-snap. These are qualities that typically take years for young quarterbacks to develop. Sanders seemed to already possess them at the professional level, but the third throw from that day became the one that people couldn't stop discussing afterward. It happened during an 11-on-11 period. The play call appeared straightforward, a simple slant route to the right, low difficulty red, the kind of play that should work unless the defense identifies it pre-snap and positions itself to disrupt. And that's exactly what happened. The linebacker had sunk into the lane. The corner was pressing the receiver. Anyone watching the alignment before the snap could see the play was dead on arrival. Conventional quarterback wisdom suggested the smart play was the check down. Take the yards, protect the football, keep the offense moving, make the safe decision. Sanders saw something different. He recognized that while the primary read was covered, there was a secondary option developing on the opposite side of the field. A receiver had worked into a passage between the sideline and a rotating safety. It was a real window, it was accessible, and it was closing at the instantaneous rate that NFL coverage windows always close. The question became, does a first-day rookie trust his arm talent and decision-making enough to make that throw? He did. And this is where the throw transcends normal practice performance evaluation. The delivery was cross-body. The trajectory was flat. The window was tight. Most starting NFL quarterbacks, guys with years of experience and playoff reps under their belts, would calculate that throw as high risk and low reward. They would take the conservative option. They would protect the football. They would understand that practice incompletions don't count, but poor decision-making habits formed in practice carry forward into games. Sanders made the aggressive decision. The receiver caught it cleanly. He secured the ball, 2 feet down. And what happened on the sideline in the 5 seconds that followed told you everything about how his teammates were interpreting his performance in real time. The offense erupted, not in a professional, controlled acknowledgement of a good play, in a genuine, spontaneous celebration that seemed almost uncontrollable. Players jumped up. People shouted. There was a genuine enthusiasm that couldn't be faked or orchestrated. When you spend years around football, you recognize the difference between polite acknowledgement and authentic excitement. This was authentic. This was unplanned. This was the kind of response that suggests teammates had witnessed something that exceeded their expectations and validated their own beliefs about this quarterback's potential. What made the moment even more remarkable was the defensive response. Defenders don't celebrate plays that beat them. That's not what happens on football fields. Players understand that when the opposing offense completes a successful play, their unit has failed in its assignment. But sometimes, when something genuinely exceptional occurs, when a play is executed at such a high level that even defenders must acknowledge the quality of execution, reactions shift. That's what happened in Berea on that Tuesday afternoon. A defensive player shook his head, not from disgust or frustration, from recognition. An unconscious acknowledgement that something noteworthy had just occurred on the field. That particular reaction from a defensive player doesn't happen every day. It happens when something breaks through the normal competitive atmosphere and registers as different, as special, as noteworthy enough to overcome the automatic competitive frustration of being beaten on a play. When evaluators witness that kind of response from opposing players, it carries significant weight. It suggests the performance transcended normal practice excellence and entered something more meaningful. The 3 throws represent a pattern rather than isolated moments. Individually impressive, certainly, but collectively, they demonstrated a level of preparation, decision-making, arm talent, and composure that seemed advanced for a first-day installation. They suggested Sanders had done extensive homework. They suggested he understood the offense conceptually. They suggested he had the kind of confidence that comes from preparation rather than arrogance. And they suggested that if this level of play continued through the off-season evaluation period, the competitive narrative might be significantly different than everyone had anticipated. Professional scouts operate within a specific set of parameters designed to prevent emotional decision-making. They've been trained across decades to separate what they want to believe from what they actually observe. They've developed systems for evaluation that minimize bias. They understand that reactions in the moment often don't translate to actual player performance over time. A single practice, no matter how impressive, doesn't define a career trajectory. A single day doesn't overwrite months of game film. A single moment doesn't validate or invalidate months of draft preparation. This training is essential because emotions lead to bad roster decisions. If scouts allowed themselves to get caught up in singular impressive performances, free agency would be chaos. Draft boards would shift based on workout performances. Personnel decisions would be driven by feelings rather than film study and systematic evaluation. The league has learned through decades of history that the scouts and evaluators who succeed are the ones who maintain discipline and emotional distance from what they witness. That's why one particular scout's reaction on May 19th carried so much weight with everyone who observed it. This wasn't just any evaluator. This was a professional with genuine years of experience in the industry. Someone who had spent the majority of his professional career watching quarterbacks at every level of football. High school showcases where 17-year-olds are still developing physically. College programs where talent levels range dramatically. The NFL draft process, where you're comparing the best quarterback from mid-major programs against the best from elite schools. Playoff games where actual consequences force players to perform at their highest level. Super Bowls where anything less than excellence results in elimination. This scout had seen it all. More importantly, he'd been specifically trained to resist emotional reactions to individual performances. His job wasn't to be impressed. His job was to evaluate accurately. To separate the excitement of a moment from the reality of long-term potential. To understand that one exceptional practice doesn't mean a player will succeed in the NFL. To maintain the kind of emotional distance that allows for objective evaluation. And yet, on May 19th, that emotional distance briefly wavered. It happened after one of those throws we discussed earlier. The one where Sanders made the aggressive decision against tight coverage. Where he threw across his body into a window that was closing. Where the ball arrived with perfect timing and perfect placement. Where his teammates erupted in genuine celebration. Where the competitive environment acknowledged the excellence of execution. The scout watched the play develop. He watched the throw. He watched the ball arrive in the receiver's hands. And then something happened that, by all his years of training, shouldn't have happened. His professional composure slipped just slightly. He turned to the person standing next to him. He gave one single nod. Not enthusiastic, not animated. One slow, measured nod. The kind of gesture you give when you're acknowledging something you weren't entirely prepared to witness, something rare enough that your years of training couldn't fully suppress the reaction. That nod communicates something specific. It's not just, that was a good play. Good plays happen regularly in professional football. Throw that nod, and you're communicating something deeper. You're acknowledging that what you just witnessed exceeded your expectations. You're admitting that something you observed challenged assumptions you'd carried into the day. You're conceding that what you're seeing on this Tuesday in May is significant enough to warrant reassessment of prior evaluations. Multiple people who were present on the sidelines noted that reaction afterward. They discussed it in conversations. They referenced it when talking about what stood out from the session, not because it was dramatic, not because the scout made some loud statement or gave some animated response, but precisely because it was understated, because it was a minimal reaction from someone trained to minimize reactions. That restraint made it meaningful. When a professional evaluator who has spent decades training himself not to react emotionally to practice field performances gives even a slight nod of acknowledgement, it means something registered differently than it normally does. It means his baseline expectations were surpassed. It means he witnessed something that, in his experience, is rare enough to warrant recognition despite his professional training to suppress emotional reactions. That particular nod, according to multiple sources present that day, became a recurring reference point in conversations afterward. People talked about what it meant. They tried to interpret what the scout was communicating without words. They understood that something significant had occurred on that practice field, something significant enough to break through years of professional discipline and emotional distance. The power of that nod lies in what it represents about professional evaluation. This wasn't someone seeing a good practice. This was someone who has evaluated quarterback talent across every level of football, someone trained to resist emotional reactions, someone who understands that singular performances don't define careers, giving an acknowledgement that what he witnessed was different, was notable, was rare enough to warrant recognition despite all his training to suppress such responses. Later, when scouts discussed May 19th in private conversations, that particular moment kept coming up. People asked the scout directly what the nod meant. He didn't elaborate extensively. He didn't make grand predictions about Sanders' NFL future. That's not what professionals do. But his response, according to those who heard it, essentially confirmed what everyone suspected. He had witnessed something that required him to reconsider initial evaluations. That nod became symbolic of something larger happening that day. Multiple evaluators watching. Multiple people recognizing that Sanders' performance exceeded baseline expectations. Multiple professionals having their assumptions challenged by what they observed. Not all at once. Not in some dramatic group realization. But gradually, through the session, building toward recognition that something significant was transpiring. The nod from that scout, more than any statistic or completion percentage, communicated that the professional evaluation community was responding to what Sanders demonstrated on May 19th. And when scouts and evaluators respond with even subtle acknowledgement of something being different, it typically means something actually was different. How a player's teammates respond to his performance often communicates more than statistics can capture. Teammates understand football at a level that casual observers don't. They know when someone is having a good practice versus when someone is doing something actually exceptional. They recognize the difference between competent execution and the kind of execution that stands out even within a room full of professional athletes. They understand when a quarterback is operating with the kind of command that suggests legitimate growth versus when he's just having a fortunate day where everything is working out. On May 19th, Shedeur Sanders' teammates responded to his performance in ways that suggested something beyond a typical good practice had occurred. The eruption on the sideline following the cross-body completion into tight coverage represented the most dramatic moment of that response, but it wasn't the only telling reaction throughout the session. What made the eruption particularly significant was its spontaneity. This wasn't an organized response. Coaches hadn't choreographed it. There was no coordinated acknowledgement planned beforehand. It was a genuine, unplanned, almost involuntary burst of excitement from the offensive unit that suggested something in their minds had shifted regarding Sanders' capabilities. When teammates erupt that way, they're communicating something specific. They're not responding politely to a competent completion. Competent completions happen throughout practice. Players acknowledge them with professional nods and brief encouragement. They move on to the next play. What triggers an uncontrolled eruption is witnessing something that exceeds baseline expectations, something that surprises you in a positive way, something that validates beliefs you've been quietly forming about a player's potential. The offensive line erupted. Receivers erupted. Running backs erupted. The entire offensive unit seemed to recognize that something had just occurred that merited genuine excitement. And here's what makes that particularly telling. Offensive players have been around Sanders for weeks at that point. They've seen him in voluntary sessions. They've watched his footwork. They've observed his mechanics. They've caught passes from him in practice settings. By the time official OTAs begin, it's not the first time the offense is seeing this quarterback operate, which means the eruption wasn't about seeing Sanders do something they'd never witnessed before. It was about seeing him do something at a level that exceeded what they'd been observing. Something that suggested improvement. Something that suggested he was operating with greater command. Something that validated the potential they'd been believing in privately. That distinction matters because it suggests the eruption wasn't born from shock that Sanders could function as an NFL quarterback. It was born from recognition that he was functioning at a higher level than he had been during voluntary sessions just weeks earlier. Teammates had apparently been quietly assessing his potential. They'd been watching. They'd been forming opinions. And on May 19th, during official team activities against actual defensive competition, something clicked. Something elevated. Something demonstrated growth that surprised them despite the fact that they'd been optimistic about his potential. The response from the bench communicated that Sanders had moved from promising prospect to player who belonged in the conversation for actual competitive opportunities. Not just someday. In this offseason, against this team, in this system, his teammates responded as if that shift had just become apparent. But the offensive sideline reaction wasn't the only telling team response that day. What happened with the defensive unit provided equally important information about how Sanders' performance was registering across the entire organization, not just with his own offense. Defenders don't typically celebrate plays they failed to defend successfully. That's not the culture of football. When the opposing offense beats you on a play, your unit has failed. You've been out-executed. You've been out-thought. You've been beaten. The typical response is frustration, maybe some profanity. Maybe some self-directed anger about the mistake. You don't congratulate the opposing quarterback for beating your coverage. That's not how competitive environments operate. And yet, on May 19th, there were reports of defensive players giving those subtle head shakes that communicate recognition rather than frustration. Not head shakes that suggest disgust at a failed assignment. Head shakes that suggest acknowledgement of executed excellence. There's a difference. Defenders understand it. It's a slight gesture that communicates, "That was well done," rather than, "We messed up." When defenders give those responses, it typically means something exceptional occurred. It means the opposing quarterback made a decision or executed a throw that transcended normal competitive interaction. It means he did something that warranted recognition despite the fact that he beat your defense in the process. It means the level of execution was high enough that defensive professionals felt compelled to acknowledge it. Multiple people present at the facility noted those defensive responses. They noted the subtle reactions that suggested the defensive unit was responding to Sanders' performance as something beyond typical practice excellence, not as something that worried them necessarily, but as something they recognized as genuinely good quarterbacking. Something executed at a level that merited acknowledgement. The combination of offensive eruption and defensive recognition created a particular atmosphere in that facility. It suggested that across multiple units, across players with different perspectives and different roles, there was recognition that something significant was happening. Sanders wasn't just having a decent practice. He wasn't just functioning adequately in his first official installation. He was operating with the kind of command that transcended normal first-day performance. Coaching staff observations reinforced this assessment. Todd Monken, the offensive coordinator tasked with evaluating whether Watson or Sanders should be the starter, was watching the same plays everyone else observed. He was processing the same information. He was witnessing the same decision-making and execution. And according to multiply became observations of a young quarterback who had perhaps already learned significant portions of it. That shift in coaching staff perspective matters because coaches are the ones making final decisions about depth charts. Coaches are the ones who will determine who gets starting reps. Coaches are the ones who will make the competitive decision. And if coaches are responding to Sanders' May 19th performance the way his teammates were responding, then the competitive dynamic has changed significantly from what everyone anticipated entering that Tuesday morning. The team's collective response, offense erupting, defense acknowledging, coaches reassessing, communicated that something had shifted in how the organization viewed significance of May 19th, you have to grapple with what came before it. Specifically, you have to understand the 2025 NFL Draft and the particular conversation that surrounded Shedeur Sanders in the weeks and months leading up to that event. Because the narrative of that draft, the reasons teams passed on him, the questions that were raised about his professional viability, all of that provides essential context for why his May 19th performance carries so much weight now. The draft discourse around Sanders was one of the most controversial conversations of the entire 2025 offseason. Multiple teams had multiple reasons for the conclusions they reached about where to invest their draft capital. Some of those reasons were legitimate football analysis. Some of those reasons involved elements that had nothing to do with football itself. Both realities existed simultaneously, and the majority of people who watched that process closely understood that distinction. Let's start with the legitimate football questions first because they're important to acknowledge honestly. Processing speed under duress. That was a genuine concern raised in evaluation rooms. How quickly does Sanders identify coverages? How rapidly can he move through progressions when defensive adjustments compress throwing windows? How does he handle situations where his first read isn't immediately available and he has to recognize secondary options? These are legitimate queries about quarterback functionality at the NFL level. They deserve serious consideration because they determine whether a prospect can functionally operate in professional systems. Consistency in pocket footwork represented another legitimate concern. Footwork matters because it determines arm placement, accuracy, and the ability to execute throws from different platforms. If a quarterback's footwork is inconsistent, his ability to make accurate throws under duress becomes compromised. That's not speculation. That's fundamental quarterbacking mechanics. Evaluators in draft rooms raised this question. Does Sanders maintain consistent footwork even when plays are breaking down and he's moving laterally within the pocket? The level of competition Sanders faced at Colorado was another legitimate topic of discussion. The Big 12 has produced NFL talent, but it's not the SEC. It's not the ACC. It's not the Big 10. When you're projecting a quarterback from a less competitive conference to the NFL, you're trying to determine whether his effectiveness at that level will translate to playing against elite defensive athletes at significantly greater speeds. That's a real evaluation question. That's not bias. That's basic preparation for determining whether a college prospect can function in the NFL. And there's the fundamental difficulty of projecting any quarterback from any program to the NFL level. Quarterbacks are the hardest players to evaluate because the position requires such specific skill sets and mental processing that performance in one system doesn't guarantee functionality in another. A quarterback who excels in one offensive system might struggle significantly in a different system with different terminology and different concepts. A quarterback who plays well within a specific style of coaching might not adapt to a different coaching philosophy. These projection challenges are real. They're valid. They deserve serious consideration. So legitimate football questions existed in draft evaluation rooms. That part is important to acknowledge. But, and this is a significant, but there's substantial evidence suggesting that something else was happening alongside the legitimate football analysis. Something that had less to do with X's and O's and more to do with other factors influencing perception. The pattern that emerged from the draft was difficult to ignore. Quarterback after quarterback went off the board before Sanders, despite evidence from film study and evaluation processes that Sanders' talent level compared favorably to several of those players who went first. Not just slightly comparable, but genuinely the kind of talent that, by pure football metrics, merited a position within the first 3 picks of the draft. Yet teams passed on him, one after another. Quarterback after quarterback who, when evaluated purely by football criteria, didn't possess superior credentials to what Sanders demonstrated in college. Now, why does that pattern matter? Because when a player has the kind of measurable, talent-based credentials that suggest first-round consideration, or even top 3 consideration, and he falls significantly further than those credentials would indicate, it suggests something beyond pure football evaluation is influencing the decision-making. That something could be bias. It could be risk aversion. It could be organizational preferences for different playing styles. It could be multiple factors combining to create a particular outcome that doesn't align neatly with talent-based evaluation. The majority of people who closely observed the 2025 draft process understood this dynamic. Many were willing to discuss it privately even if they weren't speaking publicly about it. The conversation went something like this. Sanders has legitimate questions that deserve evaluation. That's true. But the magnitude of his fall doesn't align neatly with answers to those questions. Something else is influencing perception. Something else is coloring evaluation. Something else is driving decision-making. What makes May 19th significant in this context is simple. It becomes exponentially harder to defend draft decisions based purely on football merit when you've just witnessed a young quarterback demonstrating competence against NFL-caliber defenders in an NFL system. The specific throws, the decision-making, the poise under pressure, the accuracy in tight windows, all of that happened against a defense specifically designed to expose him. All of it happened on his first official installation. All of it happened in circumstances that would reasonably challenge even experienced quarterbacks, let alone a first-day rookie. That's not to say Sanders is guaranteed to succeed in the NFL. That would be an overreach. His professional career still has enormous distance to travel. He'll face far more challenging circumstances than a practice session. He'll need to demonstrate consistency across months of evaluation. He'll need to prove that May 19th wasn't an outlier performance. That's all legitimate. But it becomes significantly harder for teams that passed on him to defend those decisions based purely on talent and football merit when he's just demonstrated functional quarterback play against NFL-level competition in his first opportunity to do so. In the back rooms where draft decisions were made, every outstanding performance Sanders delivers will serve as a constant, silent reminder of decisions made a year earlier. And some of those teams will spend considerable time over the coming months re-evaluating whether draft room conclusions about his professional viability were accurate. That's not punishment or vindication. That's just how evaluation evolves. You gather new information. That information challenges prior conclusions. You reassess. That's the cycle of professional football evaluation. And Sanders' May 19th performance just became a significant piece of new information that makes prior conclusions harder to defend. Here's where fairness demands that we acknowledge complexity, because the story of Sanders and this quarterback competition isn't simple. It's not a straightforward narrative where a young player proves everyone wrong and ascends immediately to supremacy. It's not that clean. It's not that binary. The reality of what's actually happening in Cleveland involves multiple truths existing simultaneously, which makes the situation more nuanced than simple vindication narratives allow. Deshaun Watson's experience is legitimate. This needs to be stated clearly because it's easy to get caught up in Sanders' impressive May performance and lose sight of what Watson brings to a quarterback room. Watson has 3 Pro Bowl selections. That's not an accident. That's not a byproduct of superior talent around him. That's a result of executing at a high level over multiple seasons in professional football. He has years of experience as an NFL starter. That experience is real. It's not worthless because a rookie had a good practice. The years Watson spent as a starter in Houston shaped his understanding of NFL football in ways that can't be replicated by anyone without similar experience. He's taken snaps in pressurized situations. He's managed games in the fourth quarter where the outcome was in question. He's experienced the psychological reality of playing in front of hostile crowds where crowd noise makes communication difficult. He's thrown game-winning drives. He's experienced playoff pressure. Those experiences fundamentally shape how a quarterback processes the game. A rookie quarterback, no matter how impressive he looks in practice, cannot yet understand NFL defensive disguises the way Watson understands them. Defensive coordinators develop schemes specifically designed to confuse young quarterbacks. They disguise coverages until the last possible moment. They create situations where the primary read is covered intentionally, forcing the quarterback to trust his preparation and move to secondary options. Watson has faced these schemes dozens of times. He knows what's coming. He's developed instincts based on experience. Sanders hasn't. Years of experience have given Watson the poise to handle 2-minute drives where one possession determines the game outcome. That kind of pressure cannot be replicated by OTAs. You cannot simulate the psychological reality of needing one final possession to win a football game. You cannot replicate the weight of knowing that a single decision, a single throw, determines whether your team goes home victorious or defeated. Watson has been in that situation multiple times. Sanders never has. The psychological reality of November football with playoff implications doesn't exist in May, when games matter, when records are being compiled, when seeding is being determined, when teams that play poorly in November miss the playoffs. That pressure is fundamentally different from practice pressure. Anyone who suggests otherwise hasn't thought deeply enough about what they're comparing. A spring practice session in Berea, no matter how competitive, operates under fundamentally different psychological circumstances than an actual NFL game where outcomes have real consequences. Watson's resume carries legitimate weight in any serious evaluation of this quarterback competition. His experience is real. His preparation is evident. His poise is observable. His ability to manage games is documented. All of these things matter. They don't disappear because Sanders had an impressive practice session. They don't become irrelevant because a young quarterback showed promise on May 19th. And this is a significant, but in this particular system, for this specific coaching staff, operating against this specific defense, on May 19th in present tense, the most compelling player on that field was the younger quarterback. Not because Watson didn't succeed. He operated competently throughout practice. That's not the question being raised. The question is whether Sanders' performance exceeded what the attendees anticipated, and by all available evidence, it did. That distinction matters. It's not about Watson performing poorly. It's about Sanders performing better than expected. It's about expectations being surpassed in ways that shift organizational evaluation processes. It's about a coaching staff that went into the day with a clear favorite now needing to account for a competing narrative they didn't anticipate. In this business, sometimes surpassing expectations on the first day can permanently alter evaluation trajectories. You can change how a coaching staff thinks about a player by demonstrating capability that transcends initial projections. And here's where the timeline becomes crucial to understand. The calendar still has considerable distance to travel. OTAs continue in multi-week blocks. Mandatory minicamp approaches. Training camp follows. Preseason games come after that. Each step provides new information that practice sessions cannot offer. Preseason games add crowd noise, real game speed, real consequences for decisions. Those factors will test Sanders in ways that practice simply cannot replicate. They will test Watson in ways that require actual game circumstances to accurately evaluate. Every step of this process adds information that's just not possible to gather in a practice setting. Sanders might look fantastic in May and struggle significantly when the pads come on in training camp. That's happened before. The competitive intensity increases. The physical toll accumulates. Mental fatigue sets in. All of these factors can alter performance trajectory in ways that spring practice doesn't reveal. That's why football organizations don't make season-defining decisions based on individual practice performances, no matter how impressive. Watson might look pedestrian in May and step back into clear starter territory once actual game speed arrives. Experience kicks in at different moments. Some players thrive in competitive game environments in ways they don't in practice. The psychological factors that Watson possesses, that calm, that experience, that understanding of pressure, might assert themselves in ways that practice cannot capture. That's also entirely possible. What May 19th actually changed wasn't the outcome of this competition. It changed the narrative. It created a legitimate competing story where none existed before. It provided evidence that the predetermined conclusion wasn't actually predetermined. It complicated the coaching staff's evaluation process in ways they probably didn't anticipate entering that Tuesday morning. It forced organizational recalibration. It required reassessment of assumptions that had seemed settled. But the competition itself still requires resolution across the entire off-season evaluation period. No single day determines NFL starting positions. No practice session locks in organizational decisions. May is important. It provides information. It shapes perceptions. It influences evaluation processes. But it doesn't decide competitions. That determination comes from accumulation, from pattern, from consistency demonstrated across multiple evaluative windows, From proving through every phase of preparation that the first day excellence wasn't an outlier, but the beginning of a pattern. Sanders proved something on May 19th. He proved that he can function as an NFL quarterback against NFL-level competition. He proved that his first official installation didn't reveal the limitations that had concerned draft evaluators. He proved that he had prepared substantially for this opportunity. He proved that he belonged in this conversation. But he hasn't yet proven that the competition is his. That still requires time, consistency, and demonstration of excellence across the entire off-season process. Sometimes a single moment becomes a pivot point in a larger narrative, not because that moment completely determines future outcomes, but because it fundamentally changes how people perceive what comes next. It eliminates a predetermined conclusion. It creates legitimate uncertainty where certainty had existed. It forces revaluation of assumptions that had seemed settled. That's what happened on May 19th in Berea, Ohio. A moment occurred that shifted the entire trajectory of how this quarterback competition would be discussed, evaluated, and ultimately decided. Here's what the narrative looked like walking into May 19th. Deshaun Watson was the starter. That was the organizational story. Months of reporting had cemented this conclusion. The voluntary off-season sessions had reinforced it. Every signal from the building pointed the same direction. Shedeur Sanders was the promising young prospect learning the system. That was his role. That was his narrative, not a competitor, not a challenger. A prospect with potential, someone for the future, someone to develop. Watson was the present. Sanders was a question mark about what the future might bring. That narrative had achieved a particular kind of certainty. It felt settled. It felt inevitable. It felt like the kind of organizational decision that had already essentially been made even though the official depth chart hadn't been announced. Everyone understood their role. Everyone understood the story. Everyone had accepted the version of events that had been constructed. The narrative possessed weight. It had momentum. It had seemed impossible to reverse without some extraordinary development that would fundamentally challenge its foundation. May 19th provided exactly that kind of extraordinary development. It didn't just provide good performance. It provided performance that exceeded expectations in ways that forced organizational recalibration. It provided evidence that the predetermined conclusion wasn't actually as predetermined as everyone had assumed. It created legitimate doubt where none had existed. It made the coaching staff's decision significantly more complicated instead of much simpler. And here's what makes that significant. Narratives in professional sports possess extraordinary power. Once they solidify, once they achieve organizational consensus, they're remarkably difficult to disrupt. Teams function based on narratives. Players function based on narratives. Coaching staffs function based on narratives. Fans function based on narratives. When a narrative is accepted by multiple constituencies simultaneously, it becomes almost self-fulfilling. Everyone operates as though that narrative is true, and through that collective operation, the narrative becomes true. The narrative walking into May 19th was so settled that it was essentially already determining organizational behavior. Teams were beginning to function as though Watson was the starter. The offensive unit was organizing around Watson being the primary quarterback. The defense was preparing for Watson as the guy they'd be preparing for in actual games. That narrative was shaping organizational structure before any official depth chart determination had been made. Sanders' May 19th performance disrupted that narrative fundamentally. It didn't destroy it. It didn't make it irrelevant, but it created legitimate competing narrative that suddenly made the predetermined conclusion questionable. It made the coaching staff's evaluation process more complex. It made the organizational decision less clear. It introduced genuine uncertainty where there had been organizational consensus. That shift is more significant than any individual statistic or individual throw, because narrative shifts determine how future information gets processed. Once everyone was locked into the conclusion that Watson was the starter, they would have processed subsequent events through that lens. A mediocre Watson performance would be downplayed as a bad day. A mediocre Sanders performance would be amplified as evidence that he wasn't ready. The organizational lens was predetermined. Information would be filtered through that lens. May 19th cracked that lens. It introduced doubt. It created the possibility that maybe the predetermined conclusion was premature. It made people reconsider whether they'd made assumptions too quickly. It forced organizational re-evaluation of what they thought they understood about their quarterback situation. Now, here's where the honest assessment becomes important. None of this means Sanders has won the competition, or will win the competition, or is guaranteed to be the future. That's not what a single exceptional practice day determines, but it does mean he's no longer automatically losing. It means he has a legitimate pathway forward. It means a coaching staff that seem to have already made their decision now has to actually continue evaluating, because genuine question marks have been introduced about what they thought they'd already resolved. From this point forward, every performance matters in a way it wouldn't have mattered in the predetermined narrative scenario. Watson's subsequent practices will be evaluated with fresh scrutiny. Is this guy really the clear favorite, or was that simply an assumption everyone made without actually verifying it? Sanders' subsequent performances will be evaluated for confirmation. Was May 19th an actual demonstration of capability or an outlier that won't be repeated? The information that the coaching staff extracted from May 19th has made their evaluation process more complicated. The scouts who were confident in their prior assessments left that facility with questions they weren't anticipating having to answer. The organizational consensus that had seemed settled is now genuinely unsettled. The narrative that felt inevitable is now legitimately contested. In 4 weeks, when the required minicamp arrives, teams will be watching this competition with different expectations than they would have been watching it had May 19th gone according to the anticipated script. In 6 weeks, when training camp begins, the entire organizational approach to quarterback evaluation might be different. Not because Sanders is guaranteed to succeed, but because the predetermined outcome has been disrupted and now actual competitive evaluation has to occur. Whatever this season ultimately brings, Shedeur Sanders is no longer playing a supporting role. Whether the teams that rejected him a year ago realize it or not, they're going to spend significant portions of this summer re-examining their draft room decisions. Whether Watson maintains his starting position or Sanders forces a legitimate competition, the certainty that existed before May 19th no longer exists after it. That scout's nod keeps coming back to me because it represents something specific. It represents a professional evaluator being forced to reconsider assumptions. It represents years of training not being quite sufficient to suppress the recognition that something significant occurred. It represents the moment where people stopped operating based on the narrative they'd accepted and started actually paying attention to what was happening in real time. Based on what everyone who was on those sidelines reported, based on what I understand about how front offices react when a player delivers what Sanders did on May 19th, I have no intention of betting against this young man moving forward. I was mistaken about what would emerge from those OTAs. I can say that aloud with complete confidence. And I can say with equal confidence that something genuinely changed on Tuesday morning in Cleveland, regardless of how this quarterback competition ultimately resolves. The story isn't over. It's just beginning. And for the first time, there's actually a genuine competition happening instead of a predetermined conclusion waiting to play out over the offseason. That matters. That changes everything about what comes next.